I never imagined my own son would look me in the eye and tell me I wasn't welcome at his wedding rehearsal dinner. Not because of anything I'd done, but because his fiancée didn't want me there. I remember standing in my kitchen, phone still warm against my cheek, listening to him explain it like he was reading from a script somebody else wrote. "It's just easier this way, Mom. Easier." That word would follow me for the next 11 years, showing up in every excuse, every missed holiday, every silence that stretched a little longer than the one before it. I didn't know then that the woman my son chose to marry would slowly erase me from his life, one small compromise at a time, until there was nothing left of the mother he used to call every single day. I didn't know that the same woman who smiled at me across that dinner table, the one who called me Mom, in a voice too sweet to be real, was already planning how to make sure I disappeared. And I certainly didn't know that years later, my son would show up at my door, broken and unrecognizable, asking me to forgive him for something I hadn't even discovered yet. My name is Diane Whitfield. I'm 63 years old, and for most of my life, I thought I understood what family meant. I raised my son Marcus alone. His father, Robert, left when Marcus was 4 years old. It wasn't dramatic, no shouting matches, no slammed doors that the neighbors could hear. He simply took a job transfer to Arizona and never transferred back into our lives. For the first year, he called every Sunday. By the second year, it was every other Sunday. By the third, it was birthday cards that arrived a week late, and then nothing at all. I used to sit Marcus down every night and tell him his father loved him, that grown-up things were complicated, that it wasn't his fault. I said those words so many times, I started to believe them myself, mostly because I needed to believe something in order to keep getting out of bed every morning. I worked 2 jobs for years. During the day, I was receptionist at Dr. Pemberton's dental office on 5th Street, answering phones and scheduling cleanings and smiling at people, even on days when smiling felt like the hardest thing in the world. At night, after Marcus fell asleep, I cleaned offices downtown, pushing a cart of supplies through empty hallways, vacuuming carpets under fluorescent lights, while everyone else in the world was with their families. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was just trying to keep the lights on and make sure my son never felt the absence of his father as sharply as I felt it every single day. Marcus grew into a good man, kind, hardworking, quiet in the way that made people underestimate him until they got to know him. He got a partial scholarship to state college, and I picked up extra shifts to cover what the scholarship didn't, and neither of us complained because we both understood what we were building toward. He studied mechanical engineering, graduated with honors, and landed a solid job at Halbrook Manufacturing, 2 hours from our hometown of Cedar Falls. I was so proud of him, I nearly burst every time I told someone at church about it. My Marcus, he's an engineer now, I'd say, like the word itself was a trophy I could hold up and show the whole congregation. He met Ashley during his 2nd year at the firm. She worked in accounting, 2 floors up from his department. Pretty in a sharp, polished way, always put together, always saying the right thing at the right time. The kind of woman who seemed to have rehearsed her own life before living it. When Marcus first brought her home for Sunday dinner, I made my pot roast. The one Marcus had loved since he was 8 years old. The one that filled the whole house with the smell of rosemary and browned onions before anyone even sat down at the table. Ashley picked at it with her fork, moving the meat around her plate more than eating it before saying, "It's very hearty." I usually do more Mediterranean-style cooking myself. Lighter proteins, for the metabolism. She smiled when she said it. A small, closed-mouth smile that I would come to recognize over the years as the smile she used whenever she was correcting someone without seeming to correct them at all. I laughed it off that night. I told myself she was nervous, meeting her boyfriend's mother for the first time, that nerves make people say strange things. I gave her grace because that's what you do when you love your son and want him happy. I remember washing dishes after they left, humming to myself, thinking about how maybe in time Ashley and I would find our rhythm, the way mothers and future daughters-in-law sometimes do. Looking back now, I wish I had paid attention to that moment more carefully. It was the first red flag, small and quiet, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. But there would be more. So many more, arriving one at a time, spaced out just enough that I never saw the pattern until it was already carved into the shape of my life. The engagement happened fast, only 8 months after that first dinner. Marcus called me giddy with excitement, his voice sounding like it did when he was 7 years old and had just won his first science fair ribbon. He told me how he'd proposed at the restaurant where they had their first date, how she cried, how happy they were, How he'd saved for 4 months to afford the ring Ashley had shown him in a magazine without quite asking him to buy it. I cried too that night, tears of joy, thinking about my boy starting his own family, imagining Sunday dinners and holidays and grandchildren running through my small backyard someday. I never imagined that the family I'd built with him, just the two of us against the world for so many years, was about to be dismantled by the woman he loved, piece by piece, so slowly that I would spend years telling myself I was imagining things. The wedding planning started innocently enough. Ashley's mother, Carol, was involved in every decision, which I understood at first. Mothers of the bride typically take the reins, and I told myself this was tradition, nothing more. But slowly, meeting by meeting, phone call by phone call, I noticed my seat at the table growing smaller. I wasn't consulted on the venue, a converted barn 40 minutes outside the city that I only saw for the first time in photographs after the deposit had already been paid. I wasn't consulted on the guest list, even though I had cousins and old friends of Marcus's late grandmother that I wanted to invite. People who had watched him grow up, people who had sent cards and small checks over the years just to help us get by. When I brought it up gently to Marcus over the phone one evening, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of me, he sighed the particular sigh he'd developed since meeting Ashley. A sigh that meant I was being difficult, a sigh I hadn't heard from him before her. Mom, it's Ashley's day too. Can you just let her have this? Her day too, not our day, not his day, not even shared evenly between our two families. Her day. I remember sitting there, holding the phone, staring at the steam that no longer rose from my tea, and swallowing the hurt, because that's what mothers do. We swallow so our children don't have to taste the bitterness themselves, I said. Of course, honey. Whatever makes you happy. And I meant it, even as something inside my chest cracked just slightly. The rehearsal dinner incident happened 3 weeks before the wedding. Ashley's family had booked an upscale steakhouse downtown, the kind of place with white tablecloths and a wine list thicker than a church hymnal. And I received a call from Marcus the evening before, his voice tight and apologetic in a way that made my stomach drop before he even finished his first sentence. Ashley's a little stressed about numbers for tomorrow, and she was wondering if maybe you could sit this one out. It's just family and the wedding party and, well, I am family, Marcus. I said it quietly, not as an accusation, just as a fact I needed spoken aloud. I know, Mom. I know. It's complicated with Ashley's family and the seating and everything. Carol already has the table arrangements finalized with the restaurant, and if we change it now, it throws everything off. Can you just, can you let this one go, please, for me? I sat in my kitchen that night, the same kitchen where I'd once bounced him on my hip while burning grilled cheese sandwiches on the stove behind me, the same kitchen where he'd done his homework at that same table for 12 years. And I felt something shift inside me that never fully shifted back into place. I said yes. Of course, I said yes. What else does a mother say when her son asks her to disappear for one night to keep the peace? I told myself it was just one night, just one dinner. One small thing among 1,000 small things that make up a wedding. I told myself that once the wedding was over, once the stress of planning had passed, things would go back to normal. Whatever normal was going to look like now that there was a new woman in my son's life. I didn't realize that was only the beginning. I spent that evening alone, the evening of the rehearsal dinner, sitting on my back porch with a glass of wine I didn't really want, watching the sun go down over the Hendrix's fence line, wondering what everyone was wearing, wondering what they were saying, wondering if my son had even mentioned my absence to anyone at the table, or if I had simply been erased from the conversation entirely, a footnote nobody bothered to read. I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself, more than once that night, that this was simply what it looked like when your child became an adult and built a life of his own. A life that didn't always have room for the mother who raised him. I wanted so badly to believe that. I needed to believe it, because the alternative, that this had been the opening move in something far more deliberate, was too painful to sit with. I went to bed early that night, and I dreamed, strangely, of Marcus as a little boy, no older than 6, running toward me across our old front yard with his arms outstretched, calling out, "Mommy, Mommy," the way he used to when I picked him up from school. I woke up with tears already dried on my face, and I lay there in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that whatever I was feeling was simply the anxiety of a mother watching her only child grow up and move on, and nothing more sinister than that. I had no way of knowing, lying there in the dark that night, that 11 years of smaller and smaller absences were about to begin, each one dressed up as reasonable, Each one explained away with a sigh and a, "You understand, right, Mom?" And I had no way of knowing that on the other end of all those years, a phone call would come that would break everything open at once. The wedding itself took place on a Saturday in June, under a sky so blue it looked painted on, and I sat through the whole ceremony with my hands folded in my lap, determined to be nothing but gracious. I wore a soft lavender dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, the kind of dress that says mother of the groom, without shouting it, and I cried at all the right moments. Because despite everything, I did love watching my son stand at that altar looking so certain, so hopeful, so entirely unaware of what the years ahead might hold. I was seated at a table near the back of the reception hall, tucked between Marcus's second cousin Todd, whom I hadn't seen since he was 12, and an elderly great-aunt of Ashley's who spent most of the evening asking me questions about myself and then not listening to the answers. Ashley's immediate family occupied the tables of honor near the head table, close enough to be in every photograph, close enough to be the first people the photographer called forward for the family portraits. I watched from a distance as the photographer arranged Ashley's parents, her two sisters, her grandmother, all smiling in matching poses, before someone finally remembered to wave me over for a single, hurried shot with Marcus that lasted no more than 10 seconds. Then came the dances. Marcus and Ashley had their first dance, beautiful and tender, the kind of moment you dream about for your only child. Then, instead of the traditional mother-son dance I had quietly looked forward to for months, the DJ announced a family unity dance, and Marcus took Carol's hand instead of mine, spinning his new mother-in-law slowly around the floor while the crowd applauded warmly, unaware that anything unusual had happened at all. Ashley explained it to me afterward with a bright, apologetic smile. "Oh, it's just a tradition my family does, Diane, to welcome the groom into the family. I hope that's okay. We can do something special, just the two of you, another time." Another time never came. I sat and watched my son dance with another woman while our song, Landslide by Fleetwood Mac, the one I'd hummed to him at his 8th grade father-daughter dance substitute years earlier, when no father had shown up to take him, played for someone else's mother instead. I smiled through it. I clapped along with everyone else. And later that night, alone in my hotel room, 2 towns over, because the guest list hadn't left room for me at the reception venue's overflow lodging, I sat on the edge of the bed, still in my lavender dress, and let myself cry for exactly 10 minutes before I made myself stop, wiped my face, and told myself that tomorrow was a new day. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself this was simply what happens when children grow up and build new families, that every mother goes through some version of this adjustment, that I needed to be patient and give Ashley time to feel secure in her new role before I expected anything to change. I told myself a lot of things that year, mostly because the alternative, that my son was slowly being pulled away from me by design rather than accident, was too painful to accept all at once. The first year of their marriage, we still saw each other with some regularity. Marcus would call on Sundays the way he always had, though the calls grew shorter, often ending abruptly with, "I should go." Ashley's got dinner ready, before I'd even finished telling him about my week. I invited them both to Thanksgiving that first year, and they came, though Ashley brought her own dishes because, as she explained, "We're trying to eat a bit healthier, hope you don't mind," and spent much of the meal on her phone, texting her sister about some crisis with the caterer for an upcoming event neither Marcus nor I had been told about. Then Ashley announced she was pregnant in the spring of their second year of marriage, and I thought, finally, here is something that will bring us back together. A grandchild. A reason for Marcus to need his mother again. A reason for me to be useful, to be present, to matter in some tangible way. I threw myself into preparing. I knitted a small yellow blanket, since they hadn't yet found out the baby's sex, sitting up late at night with the needles clicking softly while I imagined a small warm bundle wrapped inside it. I read parenting books I no longer needed for myself, but wanted to have ready in case Marcus or Ashley ever asked for advice. I mentally rearranged my guest room, picturing a crib in the corner where my sewing table currently sat, imagining weekend visits, sleepovers, the particular smell of a baby's head that I hadn't experienced in over 2 decades. When Emma was born on a cold January morning, I received the news secondhand, through a group text sent to what looked like 20 or 30 people at once. Emma Grace arrived at 6:14 a.m., 7 pounds 2 oz, mom and baby doing great. I called Marcus immediately, my hands shaking with joy, and he answered sounding exhausted but happy, and I asked when I could come see them. "Let's give it a couple days, Mom. Ashley wants some quiet time to bond first, just the 3 of us, before things get busy with visitors." I understood. I told myself I understood. New mothers need rest, need space, need time to adjust to this enormous new reality. I waited 2 days, sitting by my phone, refreshing nothing, because there was nothing to refresh. Just waiting for permission to meet my first and only grandchild. When I finally arrived at the hospital, the room was already crowded. Carol was there, along with Ashley's sister Brianna and Brianna's 2 young children, laughing and taking photos, passing Emma around like she was a doll being modeled at a party. I was given exactly 20 minutes with her, holding her small warm weight against my chest, memorizing the particular curve of her nose, the way her tiny fist curled around my finger, before Carol returned from the cafeteria with coffee for everyone, and the room somehow became too crowded for me to stay any longer. "We don't want to overwhelm Ashley," Marcus said quietly, walking me to the elevator, not quite meeting my eyes. "You understand, right?" I drove home that night, crying so hard I had to pull over twice on the highway. Hazard lights blinking in the dark, my chest heaving with a grief I couldn't fully name because nothing had technically happened. No one had been cruel to my face, no one had said an unkind word. And yet I felt, with a certainty that frightened me, that I had just witnessed the architecture of my own erasure being built one polite excuse at a time. I called my sister Patricia that night, from a gas station parking lot, still shaking. Patricia had never liked Ashley, had said as much at the wedding after one too many glasses of champagne, and I had scolded her for it at the time, told her to give the girl a chance. That night, though, I finally told her everything. The rehearsal dinner, the dance, the pregnancy, the 20 minutes with my own granddaughter. "Diane," she said, her voice low and steady in a way that made me listen more carefully than I wanted to. "That woman is systematically removing you. And Marcus is either too blind to see it or too weak to stop it. I've watched this happen to 2 other women at my church. It doesn't get better. It gets quieter, and then one day you realize you haven't spoken to your own son in 3 months, and you don't even remember exactly when that started." I didn't want to believe her. I told her she was being unfair, that Ashley was simply a private person adjusting to motherhood, that Marcus loved me and would never let anyone truly come between us. But driving home that night, replaying every small moment of the last 2 years, I felt a cold seed of doubt plant itself somewhere deep in my chest, a seed that would take years to fully bloom into understanding. Every year that followed proved Patricia right, one small erosion at a time. Christmases became just the 3 of us this year. Mom, we're starting new traditions of our own, delivered over the phone with a cheerfulness that felt rehearsed. Birthdays, mine and Marcus's both, became cards in the mail instead of visits, sometimes arriving a week early, sometimes a week late, always signed by all 3 of them in Ashley's careful, looping handwriting even on the cards meant for me. Phone calls that used to happen weekly became monthly, then became something I initiated entirely, always answered but rarely returned, always warm enough on the surface to make me feel foolish for noticing the growing distance beneath it. By the time Emma turned 5, I had seen my own granddaughter perhaps a dozen times in her entire life, a handful of hurried visits squeezed between other obligations, a few video calls that Ashley always seemed to end just as Emma was warming up to me. I sent gifts for every birthday and every Christmas, carefully chosen, wrapped with ribbon, and I never knew for certain if she received them, never heard a thank you note or a phone call, only occasionally caught a glimpse in a photograph months later of Emma wearing a sweater I recognized, which was the closest thing I had to proof that I still existed in her small world at all. I sent texts to Marcus that grew shorter and more careful over the years, stripped of anything resembling complaint or need, because I had learned, through painful trial and error, that anything resembling neediness resulted in even longer silences afterward. I became an expert at performing lightness. "No rush, just thinking of you both. Hope Emma's soccer season is going well." I would write, then stare at my phone for days, waiting for a reply that sometimes never came at all. And when it did come, it was 3 words long. I didn't know then, during those years of careful, hopeful little texts, that Ashley had been telling Marcus things about me behind closed doors, things that weren't true, things I would only learn much later, planting seeds of doubt about my mental state, about my intentions, even about whether I truly loved him or simply wanted to control his life the way, she claimed, I had tried to control it when he was younger and unable to defend himself. I didn't know that she had been keeping records of every phone call, of every visit, every gift, building a quiet, careful case against me that I couldn't see or defend myself from because I didn't even know it existed. All I knew was that I missed my son with an ache that never fully went away, that I missed the granddaughter I barely knew, That I had somehow become a woman who checked her phone 40 times a day hoping for a message that rarely came. A woman who had built an entire life around a single hope. That someday, somehow, things would go back to the way they used to be. 11 years passed this way, each one a little quieter than the last, each absence a little easier to explain away than the one before it, until I had almost convinced myself that this half-life of birthday cards and rare video calls was simply what my remaining years were meant to look like. And then, on a Tuesday evening in October, with the leaves just beginning to turn outside my kitchen window, and a pot of soup simmering on the stove for a dinner I would end up eating alone, my phone rang. I saw Marcus's name on the screen, and something in my chest tightened before I even answered. Some old instinct recognized that this call was different from all the careful, controlled calls that had come before it. "Mom," he said, and his voice broke on that single word, raw and unfamiliar, nothing like the polite, careful voice I'd grown used to over the past decade. "I need to see you. I need to tell you everything. I think I've made the biggest mistake of my life." I gripped the phone so tightly, my knuckles went white, my heart pounding somewhere between hope and terror, standing frozen in my kitchen while the soup began to boil over unnoticed on the stove behind me. Because after 11 years of being slowly, carefully pushed away, I didn't know if I had the strength left to let him back in, and I didn't yet know what truth was about to come crashing through the door I had spent over a decade, trying to keep from closing completely. I turned off the stove with a hand that wouldn't stop trembling and told Marcus to come over right away. He arrived 40 minutes later, and when I opened the front door, I barely recognized the man standing on my porch. My son, who had always carried himself with a quiet, steady confidence even as a boy, stood there with his shoulders curled inward, his eyes rimmed red, a duffled bag slung over one shoulder, like a man who had left somewhere in a hurry and hadn't stopped to think about what he was taking with him. "Mom," he said, and then he simply stood there, unable to finish whatever sentence he'd rehearsed on the drive over. I pulled him inside without a word, sat him down at the same kitchen table where he'd done his homework for 12 years, and made him a cup of coffee because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. He wrapped both palms around the mug, without drinking from it, staring down at the steam rising off the surface. And for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. "Ashley's leaving me," he finally said. "She's been leaving me for a while now. I just didn't want to see it." I felt my chest tighten, not with satisfaction, though I would be lying if I said no small, buried part of me didn't feel some flicker of vindication after 11 years of careful smiles and polite excuses. Mostly, though, I felt fear, because Marcus looked like a man standing in the wreckage of something much larger than a failing marriage. "Tell me everything," I said, from the beginning. It came out of him slowly at first. Then in a flood, he couldn't seem to stop once it started. He told me that 6 months earlier, he discovered a second bank account, one he hadn't known existed, opened under Ashley's name alone at a credit union across town. Over the previous 3 years, more than $200,000 had passed through that account. Money that had come from his engineering bonuses, from a small inheritance his grandmother had left him, from the sale of a rental property they'd purchased together early in their marriage. Money he had assumed was being saved for Emma's college fund, for their retirement, for the future they'd always talked about building together. Instead, most of it was gone. Some had gone toward a condo in a lakeside development 2 hours away, purchased quietly under Ashley's maiden name. Some had gone toward a business, a boutique consulting firm Ashley had started with her sister Brianna 18 months earlier, a business Marcus had never even heard mentioned, until he found the paperwork buried in a filing cabinet in the garage while looking for old tax documents. "She told me for years that Brianna's little business idea never got off the ground," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "She told me that like it was nothing, like it was just a passing thing that fizzled out. It didn't fizzle out, Mom. It's doing well, really well. And I've been paying for half of it without knowing. While she told me we couldn't afford a family vacation. While she told me Emma's braces were putting us in the red, while I picked up overtime shifts at the plant, because she said we were struggling." I sat very still, letting him talk, feeling the old anger I'd buried for over a decade rising back up through my chest like heat through a stovepipe. "There's more," he said quietly, and I braced myself because I could see in his face that whatever was coming next was the part he'd been most afraid to say out loud. "I found messages between her and someone named Dale, someone she's apparently been seeing for at least 2 years. He's a business partner of Brianna's husband. I found hotel receipts going back further than that, Receipts I'd never seen because I never had any reason to look for them. I reached across the table and took his hand, the way I used to when he was small and frightened of thunderstorms, and I said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say that wouldn't sound hollow against the size of what he was carrying. I confronted her 3 nights ago, he continued. She didn't even deny it, Mom. She just looked at me like I was the unreasonable one for being upset, she said. And I'll never forget this, she said. You've never really understood what I needed, Marcus, and I got tired of waiting for you to figure it out. Like I was the problem. Like keeping a secret business and a secret bank account and a secret boyfriend for 2 years was somehow my fault for not understanding her needs. He told me that the conversation had escalated quickly after that Ashley had, without warning, pivoted the entire fight into an accusation that he was emotionally unstable, that he'd always had control issues, that she'd been documenting his behavior for months in case she ever needed it, that she intended to file for divorce and seek primary custody of Emma, citing his temper and his unhealthy attachment to his mother as reasons he wasn't fit to have Emma more than every other weekend. That phrase landed on me like a slap, unhealthy attachment to his mother. 11 years of being kept at arm's length, of birthday cards instead of visits, of 20 minutes with my own granddaughter in a hospital room, crowded with everyone but me. And somehow I was being framed as the smothering, controlling mother-in-law who had never even been permitted close enough to smother anyone. She's been telling people that for years, hasn't she? I said quietly, and it wasn't really a question. Marcus looked up at me, and something in his face crumbled entirely. I found her laptop open 2 nights ago. There was an email thread going back almost 8 years, Mom. To her therapist, to Carol, to Brianna. She's been building this narrative since before we even got married. That you were controlling, that you'd never accept another woman in my life, that I needed to be protected from you, gradually, so it wouldn't seem dramatic to anyone watching from the outside. The rehearsal dinner, the wedding dance, the hospital, all of it. It was planned, Mom. Every single piece of it was planned. I don't know how long I sat there after he said that. Time seemed to fold in on itself, 11 years compressing down into a single, unbearable moment of clarity. Every small compromise I had accepted. Every night I had cried alone, convincing myself I was overreacting. Every time I had told my sister Patricia she was being unfair, every one of those moments now rearranged itself in my mind into the shape of a deliberate campaign, executed patiently over more than a decade, by a woman who had smiled at me across a dinner table and called me Mom in a voice too sweet to be real. Why didn't you see it? I finally asked, not with anger, but with a genuine, aching need to understand. Why didn't you notice what was happening to your own mother? Marcus put his face in his hands, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because she was so good at it, Mom. Every single time, there was a reasonable explanation. She never said, don't see your mother. She said, can we do this differently this time? Just to keep the peace, just this once. And I always agreed because keeping the peace felt like the responsible thing to do. And I never noticed that the peace only ever seemed to require you giving something up. I didn't say anything for a long time. I got up and refilled his coffee, though he still hadn't touched it, more because I needed something to do with my hands than because I thought he wanted more. When I sat back down, I asked him the question I'd been almost afraid to ask. What happens to Emma? His face, already broken, seemed to collapse further. That's the part that terrifies me most. She's already talked to a lawyer, a good one apparently, from a firm downtown that specializes in aggressive custody cases. She's planning to use the business finances against me too, somehow, to make it look like I've been financially reckless, even though every dollar that went missing went through her account, not mine. I don't even know how she'll frame that, but I know she will, because she's had years to plan every version of this. I felt something harden inside me then, something that had been softened for 11 years by grief and hope, and the desperate wish to keep a fragile peace with a woman who had never had any intention of sharing peace with me at all. I thought of every Christmas I'd spent alone, every birthday card that arrived a week late, every video call cut short just as Emma's small face lit up recognizing me. I thought of the 20 minutes in that hospital room, the dance at the wedding, the rehearsal dinner I hadn't been allowed to attend. 11 years of small, deliberate cruelties, each one dressed up in a reasonable excuse, and I finally understood, sitting there at my own kitchen table with my broken son across from me, that none of it had been accidental. None of it had been the natural drift that happens when children grow up and build lives of their own. It had been architecture, carefully designed, built brick by a woman who had correctly calculated that I loved my son too much to ever make her look bad by fighting back. She underestimated one thing, I said quietly, and Marcus looked up at me, something flickering in his exhausted eyes that looked almost like hope. She underestimated how much documentation a woman keeps when she spent 11 years quietly, carefully, sending cards nobody acknowledged, gifts nobody thanked her for, texts that were never returned. I have every single one of those messages saved, Marcus. Every unanswered text going back over a decade. I have photographs of every gift I ever sent, time-stamped, because I used to photograph them before mailing them, so I'd remember what I'd chosen for each birthday. I have the receipts. Marcus stared at me like he was seeing something he hadn't expected to find, some strength he'd forgotten his own mother might still possess after over a decade of watching her absorb every slight without complaint. You kept all of that? He asked. I kept all of it, I said, because some small part of me always suspected that someday I might need proof that I never stopped trying. We sat there together as the evening deepened outside my kitchen window, the soup long since cold and forgotten on the stove, and for the first time in 11 years, I felt something shift inside my chest that wasn't grief. It was resolve. Whatever Ashley had built over the past decade, whatever careful narrative she intended to present to a judge, and to her own family, and to Emma someday when she was old enough to ask questions, I understood now that it was about to meet something she had never accounted for. A mother who had spent 11 years being quietly erased, and who still had every piece of evidence needed to prove that she had never actually disappeared at all. There's something else, Marcus said suddenly, his voice dropping even lower, and I saw his hand tremble around the coffee mug. Something I found in that filing cabinet along with the business paperwork. A document with your name on it, Mom, from years ago. I don't fully understand what it is, but I think you need to see it before this goes any further. He reached into the duffel bag at his feet and pulled out a thin manila folder, its edges soft and worn as though it had been handled many times over many years, and slid it across the table toward me, with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I looked down at my own name written across the tab in Ashley's careful, looping handwriting, and I felt a cold understanding settle over me before I'd even opened it. A sense that whatever waited inside that folder was about to change everything I thought I understood about the last 11 years of my life. I opened the folder with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. And the first thing I saw was a photograph of myself taken from across a parking lot, dated nearly 9 years earlier. I was getting into my car outside the grocery store on Elm Street, wearing a coat I hadn't owned in years, completely unaware that I was being photographed. Beneath it was another and another, dozens of them, spanning almost a decade, each one time-stamped and organized by year in neat plastic sleeves. Me at church, me at Patricia's house, me sitting alone at a diner I used to visit on Sunday mornings after Marcus stopped calling as often. What is this? I whispered, though some cold, clear part of me had already begun to understand. Marcus's hands were shaking as he pointed to a stack of typed pages beneath the photographs. Keep going, he said. There's more. The typed pages were reports, formal ones, printed on letterhead from an agency called Cornerstone Discretion Services. A private investigator hired under Ashley's name, retained continuously for nearly 9 years. The reports documented my routines, my finances, even a brief period after I'd fallen behind on a credit card payment during a slow month at the dental office, noted with a clinical little annotation that read, "Subject appears to be under moderate financial strain. Useful for future framing regarding subject's stability and intentions." Framing. My own daughter-in-law had paid a stranger to follow me for 9 years, not because she suspected me of anything, but so that she would have material ready whenever she needed it, to make me look unstable, unreliable, potentially dangerous to be around, in case anyone ever questioned why Marcus's mother had so quietly vanished from his life. Beneath the investigators' reports were printed emails, dozens of them, exchanged between Ashley, Carol, and Brianna over the years, threads with subject lines like "Keeping D" at a comfortable distance and the DW situation updated plan. I read through them with Marcus sitting silently beside me, and with every message, the last 11 years of my life rearranged themselves once more, this time into something even colder and more calculated than I had understood the night before. One email sent by Ashley to Carol 4 months before the wedding read, in part, that she intended to start the distancing early, before the wedding, so it looks organic by the time we have kids, and that she planned to use small excuses at first, nothing dramatic, just enough that Marcus gets comfortable saying no to her on my behalf. Another email, sent the week after Emma was born, discussed limiting my hospital visit to establish the pattern early, so extended family time never becomes an expectation. I sat back in my chair, the folder open on the table between us, and for a long moment I simply couldn't speak. Marcus reached across and took my hand, his own eyes wet, and said the words I had waited 11 years to hear without ever quite admitting how badly I needed them. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I should have seen this so much sooner." I let her convince me that keeping the peace meant keeping you at a distance, and I never once stopped to ask myself why peace always seemed to require that particular sacrifice. "How did you get this folder?" I asked quietly. It was in the garage filing cabinet, buried under old tax documents, like she never expected anyone to look for it. I think she kept it as leverage, in case I ever tried to push back against her, or in case she ever needed proof to justify things to a judge someday. I don't think she ever imagined I'd find it before she needed to use it herself. We sat together at that kitchen table until nearly midnight, going through every page, and by the time we finished, I understood something I hadn't expected to feel amid all that grief and anger. I felt, for the first time in over a decade, entirely certain that I hadn't imagined any of it. Every quiet ache, every night I'd cried and told myself I was being unreasonable, every conversation with Patricia I'd argued against out of loyalty to a marriage I desperately wanted to believe was simply new and adjusting. All of it had been real, documented, deliberate. There is a particular kind of relief that comes from learning you were right about something painful, even when the truth itself is far worse than you imagined. The next morning, Marcus called a family law attorney recommended by a coworker, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Renata Alvarez, who listened to the whole story without interrupting, then asked to see the folder for herself. She went quiet for a long time as she flipped through the photographs and the investigator reports, and when she finally looked up, her expression had changed entirely. "This isn't just useful for a custody case," she said. "This is a private investigator retained without disclosed purpose, tracking a private citizen for 9 years, combined with written intent to manipulate custody proceedings, misrepresent your son's mental state. Depending on how the finances shake out, we may also be looking at fraud. This folder doesn't just protect your custody rights, Marcus. It could dismantle everything she's built." Over the following weeks, the case moved faster than any of us expected. Renata subpoenaed financial records from the consulting business Ashley had started with Brianna, and it became clear that the $200,000 pulled from the joint accounts hadn't simply funded a lakeside condo and a boyfriend's lifestyle. It had also been funneled into the business under vague consulting fees, money that Ashley and Brianna had never properly declared. Catching the attention of an accountant Renata brought in who flagged the pattern almost immediately as tax fraud. When Ashley's own mother, Carol, was deposed and shown the email threads with her name attached to them, something in the family's carefully maintained unity finally cracked. Carol, it turned out, had grown increasingly uncomfortable over the years with how far Ashley had taken things, uncomfortable enough that she'd kept her own quiet reservations to herself, but never quite erased the paper trail, proving her early participation. Faced with the threat of her own exposure, Carol testified that Ashley had planned the isolation deliberately from the earliest days of the engagement, confirming everything Marcus and I had already read for ourselves in her own handwriting. The custody hearing, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic after everything that had led to it. Ashley's attorney tried, briefly, to argue that Marcus's unhealthy attachment to his mother made him an unfit primary guardian. But the argument collapsed within minutes once Renata submitted the folder as evidence, along with 9 years of unanswered birthday cards and photographed, timestamped gifts that I had, indeed, kept meticulous records of without ever fully understanding why. The judge granted Marcus primary custody of Emma, with supervised, limited visitation for Ashley pending the outcome of the separate financial fraud investigation that had, by then, been referred to the district attorney's office. I wish I could say that watching Ashley's carefully constructed life collapse brought me some kind of triumphant satisfaction, and for a brief, human moment outside the courthouse, watching her walk to her car alone, her sister no longer speaking to her, after the financial fraud implicated Brianna's own business too, I did feel something sharp and vindicated rise up in my chest. But mostly, standing there in the cold autumn air with Marcus beside me, I felt something quieter and heavier settle over me instead. Grief, for 11 years I could never fully get back. Grief, for the version of Emma's childhood that might have included regular Sunday dinners at my kitchen table. Sleepovers in a guest room that had sat empty for over a decade. Memories we would never get to make because they belonged to years already spent. But grief wasn't the only thing waiting for me on the other side of that courthouse. Emma is 9 years old now, and she has my late mother's eyes, something I didn't discover until she came to live with Marcus full-time, and I finally had the chance to really look at her, to sit across from her at Sunday dinner, to watch her long enough to notice the small details that had been hidden from me for most of her life. She was shy with me at first, understandably, since she barely knew the woman who kept sending unopened gifts and unanswered cards. But children are remarkably resilient and remarkably honest in ways adults have long forgotten how to be. 3 months after the custody ruling, she crawled into my lap during a thunderstorm, the same way Marcus used to when he was small, and asked me quietly why I hadn't visited more when she was little. I didn't tell her everything. She was too young for the full weight of it, and some truths about her mother are hers to discover slowly in her own time, when she's old enough to hold them without breaking. I simply told her that some grown-up things had kept us apart for a while, that it was never because I didn't love her, and that I intended to spend the rest of my life making up for lost time if she'd let me. She nodded, the way children do when they've decided to trust you, and asked if I would teach her how to make the pot roast her daddy always talked about, the one with rosemary that filled up the whole kitchen. We made it together the following Sunday, Emma standing on a step stool beside me, her small hands clumsily chopping carrots while I guided her fingers away from the blade. Marcus setting the table behind us the way he used to as a boy, humming along to the radio without quite realizing he was doing it. The kitchen filled with that same smell of rosemary and browned onions I remembered from all those years ago, and for the first time in over a decade, my house felt entirely, completely full again. Ashley pled guilty to tax fraud 18 months later, receiving probation and a substantial fine rather than jail time, though her business partnership with Brianna dissolved entirely under the weight of the investigation, and I heard, secondhand, that she eventually moved out of state to start over somewhere no one knew her history. I don't know if she's found peace wherever she landed. I've made my own peace with not needing to know. Marcus and I talk every single day now, not out of the careful, anxious hope I used to feel checking my phone 40 times waiting for a message that rarely came, but out of a simple, comfortable habit rebuilt slowly over the past 2 years. He still carries guilt over the 11 years he let slip past without fully seeing what was happening. And some days that guilt surfaces in quiet apologies I no longer feel the need to accept, because I've come to understand something important in all of this. Forgiveness isn't a single moment, it's a practice, something you choose again and again until one day you realize you've stopped counting the times you've had to choose it. I think often about that folder, still sitting in a box in my closet, the photographs of myself taken across a decade by a stranger paid to prove I didn't deserve a place in my own son's life. I could have let those photographs become a permanent wound, proof of everything that was stolen from me. Instead, I've come to see them differently. They are proof, in the end, of exactly how much effort it took to erase me. Proof that I was never actually the problem anyone claimed I was. Proof that a mother's love, even quietly persistent and unacknowledged for over a decade, leaves a record that cannot simply be wished away. Last month, Emma asked if she could sleep over on a Friday night, just the two of us, and stayed up late watching old movies, sharing a bowl of popcorn on my living room couch, the same couch where I used to sit alone for so many holidays, wondering if I would ever get a chance like this again. She fell asleep against my shoulder somewhere around 11, and I sat there for a long while afterward, not moving, simply grateful, in a way I don't think I could have explained even a few years earlier, for every ordinary, unremarkable moment I once feared I would never get to have. I lost 11 years I will never get back. But I learned, in the end, that some love is patient enough to wait out even the longest silence, and that the truth, however long it takes to surface, eventually finds its way home.